Excerpt about democracy from the book Upbringing of Children, Adolescents and Adults.
Created by Solon Hinson. Date 26 February 2024. Translated by Solon Hinson. Corrections and review made by FIGU-Carolina.
Erziehung der Kinder, Jugendlichen und Erwachsenen.
Upbringing of Children, Adolescents and Adults, pages 29 to 32, 34, 37 to 39.
Page 29 to 32.
If we observe and consider the culture of individual past folks and tribes, then we can see without doubt that each one has developed a very specific way of educating children and adolescents, as is still the case today. In the past, and still today, everything in education was and is traditionally regulated, but its significance can only be recognized and understood when the individual forms of society are observed and considered, in each of which their own traditions of educational prevailed and still prevail today. Especially in poor and primitive societies can the meaning of tradition be very well traced and understood. Since time immemorial, and also today, every ethnic group, every clan, and every tribe has its own educational traditions, according to which children and adolescents were and are brought up. From these traditional forms of education, very specific and characteristic behaviors have emerged in every society, family, clan, tribe, and ethnic group right up to the present day, which are based on their own typical peculiarities. From this, it can also be recognized that every culture has always had its own educational methods, and still has them today, in which their own methods of life situations, life problems, and coping with life have always played and continues to play a decisive role. In contrast to the old days, however, since every child, every adolescent, as well as women and men, knew very well through tradition what was generally and specifically expected of them. This is unfortunately no longer the case today, because the traditions have suffered greatly in modern times, and the cultures have become extremely complicated in every respect due to all the innovations. The old passed-down traditional methods of upbringing were simply ignored and discarded, including the method that children and adolescents should be allowed to question everything so that they become knowing, understanding, and responsible based on reason and logic. What was also forgotten was what was known in ancient times and had great value, namely that children, adolescents, and adults knew how to behave with decency, respect, and dignity. But this has changed fundamentally in modern times due to the increasing so-called understanding of democracy, with evil effects that have largely destroyed true interpersonal relationships and which has also given rise to an almost limitless indifference and intellectually influenced feelinglessness towards human beings and all life. In this respect alone, the major changes have brought about a fundamental change in cultures, a change that is doubtful on the one hand, but also worthy of recognition on the other, especially with regard to the realization that all human beings as such are equal, and therefore also an equal worthiness must dominate among everyone. However, if the whole of equal worthiness is observed and considered in each case more exactly, then it is terrifyingly established that, on the whole, everything is a farce, because on the one hand, this equality only concerns men and women, and as a rule, with exceptions, children and adolescents are excluded from this. On the other hand, despite the proclamation of the equal worthiness of all human beings, the women today are still largely discriminated against, and the children and adolescents are treated below their dignity. In addition, women, children, and adolescents are treated like cattle, enslaved, beaten, sexually abused, forced into work and prostitution, and even murdered if they do not obey, be it too much, or can no longer do the work that has been forced on them, etc. And it is actually claimed, contrary to all truth, that the current times are better than previous times, and that in the present humanity is gradually gaining understanding, reason, and responsibility. Naturally, a lot has changed for the better since ancient times, but it is not actually not much in the sense of humanity, because there are still 42 million slaves on the earth, as well as serfs and many human beings who suffer from hunger or perish as a result of miserable living. Conditions like, however, also how many are ruled by the family hierarchical relationships, or how many do not receive a proper or good and valuable upbringing. And when all of this is observed and considered, then it is recognized that democracy is completely misunderstood, because it is truly not just a political ideal, but fundamentally a personal duty and a way of life for every human being, for women, men, children, and adolescents. This upbringing teaches the children and adolescents that leads, among other things, that they don't nurture a self-seeking world of thoughts and feelings, but nurture an attitude that is shaped in this respect. These ensures that a communal principle forms the thoughts and feelings of children and adolescents into adulthood, and that a personal democratic stance of consciousness, mindset, shapes the attitude, responsibility, behavior, and the entire way of life.
Page 31.
Especially in today's world, the human beings at large generally are not clear about a lot of changes which are taking place incredibly quickly. Rather, only those few who make an effort to deal with the blatant predominating zeitgeist. With these changes, the ones that are mainly being addressed here are those that relate to the social atmospheres, which, through the influence of the usual democratic behavior everywhere, has developed into a factor through which the conventional, that is to say, traditional methods of upbringing become increasingly more disregarded, neglected, and forgotten. Also, the social form of equal worthiness, that is to say, equal rights, has arisen from these democratic atmospheres, which in and of itself would be good and right if it were also actually maintained, which sadly is not the case because everything continues to great measure in the old way. Equal worthiness would mean that no human being can rule over the other, but this is exactly what is being counteracted by the majority of parents, other educators, and through certain educational psychologists, because they assume a ruling role over children and adolescents, as is generally the case with kings, emperors, other rulers and authorities, as well as with religious bigwigs in general, also with regard to the population, which was the case in earlier times and is partly still the case today. A social and democratic equal worthiness or equal rights means that every human being decides their own personal matters themselves, so that no one else stands over them in this respect, and no one else has to exercise might over them, and therefore no one else rules over them. However, this also applies to children and adolescents in such a wise that they are recognized as being of equal worthiness. That is to say, equal rights, and they will not be suppressed and harmed in any kind and wise. In the upbringing, they must therefore also be allowed the free decision to implement, that is to say, bring to usage, what they have learned in good value. In order for them to be able to do this, however, everything must be correctly, extensively, and instructively explained to them so that they are able to logically follow and understand it. And if this is done, then the instructing upbringing also shows valuable successes in the form that the children and adolescents become self-responsible and fit into the social order, and thus also into the social norm on their own initiative and free will. Basically, this requires a correct, good and valuable upbringing and instruction from the parents, other legal guardians, and educational psychologists, wherewith there may be no dominance over the children and adolescents. These children and adolescents, in regards to equal worthiness, must be sufficiently set equal to their educating grown-up counterparts in regard to their age, understanding, and their rationality and abilities of logic. Subsequently, a partnership relationship must be given. However, if problems arise in this relationship with regard to the fact that the human being that is being raised makes mistakes, carries out wrong decisions or actions, or commits incorrect deeds, and so on, then these alone are to be addressed and complained about, but not the human being, because as such and as a personality, he or she, the human being, must remain a taboo subject in any case. So a child, an adolescent, or an adult, as a human being and personality, may never become attacked and insulted, because solely and alone only the mistake may become pointed out, or the wrong action or deed brought up in conversation. If this is not done, then an injury to the human's integrity results, which can have the consequence of damages which weigh heavily in regard to the condition of the psyche and to the general behavior in both children and adolescents, just as with adults. Not seldom do behavioral disorders of various kinds arise, causing children and adolescents as well as adults to flip out and engage in antisocial Ausartungen that often last for decades and even persist into old age.
Page 34.
Racism is also a severe social problem that could be avoided through a correct and good educational upbringing and through a correct personal understanding of democracy and democratic behavior.
Page 37.
The minority who have fallen out of the majority who are not skilled at the upbringing, those adults, parents and developmental psychologists who have recognized the change of the social atmospheres and as a result also have created in themselves a personal individual democratic stance, and therewith also an understanding of equal worthiness and an understanding of equal rights, also turn themselves to valuable methods of upbringing. For them, being democratic doesn't mean simply a political condition, like also not simply having the freedom to be able to do and allow that which they want. Rather, for them, being democratic means that they are due the same values and rights of all human beings. Children and adolescents have also reached this point today, because the knowledge and general democratic aspirations, as well as their understanding and values in modern times, do not pass them by unnoticed. In fact, at their young age, they are more attentive, more inquisitive, more eager to learn, and above all, more neutral than adults. As a result, they reflect upon everything also more meticulous, and they attain a reasonable attitude towards being democratic if they aren't misled and misbrought up by adults who are misbrought up. However, if a miseducation and misinstruction results in regards to the being democratic through adults or parents, then the children and adolescents learn to misinterpret the democracy. This happens in such a way that they come to a false understanding about freedom, try to recycle the societal norms according to their own dumb ideas, according to their own false will, and without regard of desires and of other human beings, just like they want it. If this happens, the children and adolescents reach the point where they rebel against every instruction and education, as well as against every restriction, no matter how necessary and appropriate. This denial results then inevitably from the false form of misupbringing not being brought up right, and from the misunderstanding of that which is truthfully the real being democratic. The misinstruction and miseducation has therefore a result that the children and adolescents who are hard-headed in this regard to see their wrong actions as a false privilege and permission to do what they want to do, wherein they see their ability to be democratic and their freedom and accept this as proven. Yet truly, this has nothing to do with being democratic and nothing with freedom, rather only with enmities towards a righteous way of life and guiding of life, towards honor and worthiness, as well as towards the virtuousness and the respect towards the life, the human beings, and the society. To simply take out the privilege, to do and to permit what even is wanted, has nothing to do with democratic values, like it mainly does not have to do with decency or righteousness, rather solely and alone with licentiousness and Ausartung against all that which is of humanly high values. If it were the case that every human being simply insisted on doing what they desired, then the whole world would consist only of tyrants, and therefore there would only be strife, terror, and war. This is also proven through the self-important state rulers of the earth, who are completely miseducated, domineering, power-hungry, and criminal in launching rebellions and murderous and destructive wars, as a result of which hundreds of thousands and millions of human beings would lose their lives. Through misinstruction and miseducation, constant friction, constant arguments, violence, jealousy, retaliation and revenge, as well as criminality and rule-breaking, psychological damage, illnesses, and all evils are pre-programmed. Even the smallest unpeace, the smallest unfreedom and disharmony bothers the interpersonal relationships. As a result from that aggravation, hate, nerve disturbances, and irascibility originate. And not rarely originates from all these vilenesses, murder and manslaughter, or evil lifelong strife.
Page 39.
True personal, internal, and external freedom is a part of personal individual being. Democratic, just as freedom is also a part of political democracy. And just as political democracy requires freedom within itself in order to be able to give this freedom to the outside world, the human being must also be able to further give their own personal, individual, democratic freedom. Both the state and the human being themselves can only further give freedom if they actually possess it themselves. But that is exactly a fact that the majority of the human beings of the earth know nothing about, and which is not recognized because they do not care about these facts. And this truth is also not taught to children and adolescents. As a result, they grow up in unknowledge regarding this. So it is therefore necessary that educational instruction be explained to them that no human being can really enjoy external freedom if their neighbor cannot also enjoy it. In the freedom is namely also order given, and that means that these two values bring also certain limitations with themselves, which prevents that unrighteous things don't become done, which are directed against the freedom and order and which eventually can harm the neighbor. So freedom and order therefore also bring with them obligations of many kinds, which must be taught to children and adolescents from the very beginning in their education, so that they become righteous and respectful of life, as well as life-affirming and true human beings in every possible wise. Freedom is, however, still very much more extensive, because it saves in itself also the responsibility in every hindsight. So for the own person, for the own family, for all human beings all round, and for the whole humanity. So however also for the nature, the mammal world and animal world. The responsibility is, however, also hereon laid out that good interpersonal relations become cared for, like also true love, peace, freedom, and harmony in extensive kind and wise. The limitations, which are bound with the freedom, coincide with the rules, which in regard to the security and order for every human being, are of great importance and thus must be given, because only if order and security exists, can freedom also exists. This order must thus become respected for the welfare of the individual and of all human beings from everyone. As a result from the children, adolescents, and adults, which however determines that they become upbringing instructingly taught from the ground up and become cared by them as well as from the adults. This security-bringing order may not be dictatorial, nor simply authoritarian, but rather voluntary and accompanied by the associated freedom of those being educated,